When American fighter pilots first encountered the Kawasaki Ki-48 in 1942, they couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for the Japanese crews. Here was a bomber so poorly armed that a single pass could shred it to pieces, so slow that even aging fighters could catch it easily. They called it Lily, a delicate flower name for what they saw as a delicate aircraft. But war has a way of transforming weakness into unexpected strength, and by 1945, this same fragile bomber would strike more fear into American hearts than almost any other Japanese aircraft. The Ki-48. I made its combat debut in China in the autumn of 1940 and lived up to expectations, proving to be almost immune to interception. Japanese crews flying the new bomber felt like they owned the skies. The aircraft they piloted represented Japan's answer to a shocking wake-up call: the appearance of Soviet-built SB-2 bombers in Chinese hands that had proved nearly impossible for Japanese fighters to catch. Kawasaki received an order to develop a high-speed bomber capable of 480 km/h 300 mph at 3000 m, 9800 ft, and able to reach 5000 m, 16,000 ft within 10 minutes. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force wanted speed above all else. They'd seen what fast bombers could do: strike quickly, escape before fighters could respond, return to base while enemy interceptors still searched empty skies. The man behind this new bomber was Doi Takeo, Kawasaki's chief designer. Kawasaki received the specification in December 1937, and a team led by Doi Takeo based the design on lessons learned from the Ki-45 Nick. He faced an almost impossible timeline. The army wanted their bomber fast, and they wanted it now. Drawing from his experience with the troubled Ki-45 twin-engine fighter project, Doi pushed his team to work around the clock. Because of the priority placed on the troubled Nick program, the Ki-48 prototype was not complete until July 1939. When test pilots first took the sleek twin-engine bomber into the air, they discovered a serious problem: severe tail flutter that threatened to tear the aircraft apart at high speeds. It took 5 more pre-production aircraft and months of modifications before engineers finally solved the issue by raising the horizontal tail surfaces and strengthening the rear fuselage. By the time production began in earnest, the first production aircraft began rolling out of the factory in July 1940. The Imperial Japanese Army had already designated it the Army Type 99 twin-engined light bomber. But to Allied intelligence officers who would later catalogue every Japanese aircraft they encountered, it would simply be known as Lily. First unit to operate the type in combat was the 45th Sentai in northern China, where it proved to be very successful due to a lack of opposition. Those early missions over China must have felt like training flights. The Ki-48 would take off from their bases, climb to altitude, and cruise at speeds that left Chinese fighters helplessly behind. Facing no real opposition from the Chinese Air Force, the Ki-48 eyes performed satisfactorily, and the aircraft's speed was praised by its crews. The bomber itself was a study in Japanese aircraft design philosophy of the era: prioritize performance over protection. It carried an 800 kg, 1760 lb bomb load. This wasn't much, even by 1940 standards. Less than the single-engined Hawker Typhoon fighter bomber, but the Japanese believed speed would be its shield. Initial versions were armed with 3 flexibly mounted 7.7 machine guns, one in the nose, and one each in rear-firing dorsal and ventral positions. These pop guns, as American pilots would later call them, were barely adequate against the outdated Chinese fighters of 1940. Against modern Allied aircraft, they would prove almost useless. But in those early days, none of that mattered. The Ki-48 represented Japanese technological advancement, proof that they could match anything the West could produce. Pilots loved how the bomber handled. The Ki-48 was quite aerobatic and could loop and turn with an experienced pilot at the controls. Lily saw its first operational use in North China, where it encountered almost no fighter opposition. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred expansion. Soon, Kai-48 were being shipped throughout Japan's expanding empire. By December 1941, when Japan launched its war against America and Britain, these bombers were stationed from Burma to the Philippines, ready to support the lightning advances that would shock the world. The early Pacific War seemed to validate everything about the Kai-48 design. The aircraft served in China from June 1940, replacing the Kawasaki Kai-32, and were widely used in the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Dutch East Indies in those chaotic first months. When Allied forces were reeling backward and Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, the Lily played its part in countless missions. But cracks were already beginning to show. When Kai-48s encountered modern Allied fighters, American P-40s, British Hurricanes, Australian Spitfires, the results were devastating. The Kai-48 I was definitely obsolete by the start of the Pacific War, being slow and lacking adequate defensive armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots quickly learned the bomber's weaknesses. Those three light machine guns could barely discourage an attacking fighter. The lack of armor meant that even rifle-caliber bullets could penetrate the crew compartments. And without self-sealing fuel tanks, a few incendiary rounds could turn the Lily into a flying torch. One American pilot, flying a P-40 over Burma in 1942, later recalled his first encounter with a Kai-48. "I couldn't believe how easy it was. One good burst, and the thing just came apart. No armor, no real defense. I actually felt bad for the crew." This sentiment, a mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy, would be echoed by Allied pilots throughout the war. The Japanese knew they had a problem. An improved version, the Kai-48 Roman II, was already being developed in late 1941. Engineers added more powerful engines with better high-altitude performance. It had armor protection to both fuel tanks and crew, the pilot armor being up to 0.65, 16.5 mm in thickness. They increased the bomb load and tried to improve the defensive armament. The prototypes first flew in February 1942. Power was provided by two Nakajima Ha-115 engines, with a two-stage blower that improved higher altitude performance and a normal rating of 1,150 HP, compared to 950 HP on the Kai-48I. The Kai-48 Roman II had a top speed of 314 mph at 18,375 ft, but it wasn't enough. The improvements that seemed so significant on paper proved marginal in combat. Allied fighters had improved too, and they'd improved faster. By 1943, even the upgraded Kai-48 Roman II was easy prey. However, the improvements were not enough to eliminate its vulnerability to Allied fighters, and efforts to improve the armament were largely unsuccessful. Large numbers of this aircraft were destroyed on the ground in New Guinea. American and Australian airfield raids would catch dozens of Kai-48s parked in neat rows, their camouflage paint useless against pilots who knew exactly where to look. In minutes, entire squadrons would be reduced to burning wreckage. The Japanese tried everything to keep their Kai-48 operational. This was due to the use of small ship formations, 3 to 10 aircraft escorted by large numbers of fighters, 2575, typically Nakajima Kai-43, but there were never enough fighters, and the ones available were increasingly outclassed by Allied aircraft. By 1944, the writing was on the wall. Production ended in October 1944 after 1408 Kai-48 Roman II had been built. In total, Kai-48 production netted 1997 units. But Japan's situation had become desperate. The homeland was under threat, the navy had been shattered, and conventional bombing missions were suicide runs with little chance of success. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that someone history doesn't record exactly who looked at the warehouse full of obsolete Kai-48 and saw not useless relics, but weapons for a new kind of warfare. If these bombers couldn't survive conventional missions, perhaps they could be useful for one final flight. All models continued in service until the Battle of Okinawa during April 1945, When many were converted into kamikaze aircraft, Kai-48 Roman II Kai Tayatari, armed with an 800 kg 1760 lb bomb. The modifications were grimly simple. Engineers removed unnecessary equipment to save weight. They packed the bomb bay with explosives. Aircraft were outfitted with 1,700 lb of explosives and piloted by minimal crew, usually two, to their final destinations. The official designation was Kai-48 Roman II Kai Special Attack Aircraft. But everyone knew what they really were: flying bombs guided by human pilots who would never return home. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. Having earlier placed the 3rd and 10th Air Fleets under the 5th Air Fleet, the Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet now ordered that the combined force attack enemy forces around Okinawa. Our combined naval air strength amounted to about 1815 planes, including 540 special attack planes, and the 6th Army Air Force had been ordered to cooperate with us. Preparations were being made for this all-out effort when the enemy, on the first day of April, made their first landings on Okinawa. On April 6, 1945, the first wave of 10 coordinated kamikaze attacks began to hit the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet off the coast of Okinawa. Ships in the 5th Fleet had experienced suicide attacks before, but never on such a scale. The terrifying sight of Japanese pilots diving their planes into ships would become common over the next 2.5 months. American sailors watching from their ships could hardly believe what they were seeing. These weren't the desperate actions of individual pilots whose planes had been damaged. This was organized, coordinated, deliberate. Wave after wave of aircraft, including many Kai-48, approached the American fleet with no intention of returning. John Chapman, a 21-year-old gunner's mate aboard the destroyer USS Newcomb, struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. Facing enemy pilots willing to give their lives to sink his ship struck him as almost incomprehensible. It didn't make you feel good. I don't know whether that's terrified or not, but it didn't make you feel too well because of it, knowing that people would do a thing like that. You know, people we had always known weren't like that. They were brave people and so forth, and they fight, but weren't someone to just deliberately take their lives to take yours. The Kai-48s assigned to kamikaze units were often the most worn-out examples available. Engines that leaked oil, control surfaces that didn't quite respond correctly, instruments that gave false readings. None of it mattered for a one-way mission. What mattered was that they could take off, stay airborne long enough to reach the American fleet, and carry their load of explosives to the target. The pilots chosen for these missions were typically young, often with minimal training. The elaborate flight skills that had once made Kai-48 pilots proud, the ability to loop and roll, to place bombs precisely on target, to evade enemy fighters were unnecessary. All they needed to know was how to take off and how to aim their aircraft at an American ship. Yoshio Itsui, 32, a unit commander who led the first flights from Karen Air Base on April 1, 1945, the kickoff date of the amphibious invasion of Okinawa. Most Japanese, especially the well-educated student soldiers and aviators, knew well before 1944 that Japan was going to lose the war. The transformation of the Kai-48 from conventional bomber to kamikaze weapon represented everything that had gone wrong with Japan's war. An aircraft designed to showcase Japanese technological prowess had become a symbol of desperation. Pilots who had once taken pride in their skill now measured success by their willingness to die. But the American response to kamikaze attacks was evolving too, although U.S. Navy commanders were initially surprised by the first large-scale kamikaze attacks. They were quick to respond, and within weeks were identifying measures to defend against this new threat. Radar picket ships were stationed far from the main fleet to provide early warning. Combat air patrols were increased. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to concentrate their fire on single targets, knowing that even a heavily damaged kamikaze could still hit its target if the pilot remained alive. The last pair of Seafires chased the 5 remaining Kai-48s inside the screen. and with the support of returning Vought F-4U Corsairs and Grumman F-6F Hellcats, which had just been scrambled, shot down all of them amongst intense AA fire. One Seafire was slightly damaged, and one Hellcat was written off due to friendly fire, but the only ship to be damaged was the carrier HMS Illustrious, hit by heavy AA shells. Not all kamikaze attacks succeeded. Many Ki-48 were shot down miles from their targets. Others, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, crashed into the sea short of their objectives. Some pilots, perhaps having second thoughts at the last moment, missed their targets entirely, but enough got through to make the kamikaze campaign a source of deep anxiety for American sailors. Suicide attacks by aircraft or boats at Okinawa sank or put out of action at least 30 U.S. warships and at least 3 U.S. merchant ships, along with some from other Allied forces. The attacks expended 1465 aircraft. Among these were many Ki-48, their obsolete frames carrying young men to their deaths. The statistics tell only part of the story. Various forms of kamikaze attack, including planes, manned rockets, and human torpedoes, did sink 36 American ships and damage a further 368, inflicting 10,000 casualties, half of them killed. But numbers can't capture the psychological impact of facing an enemy willing to turn themselves into guided missiles. 91 sailors were killed or wounded on the USS Newcomb. Many of those who were injured suffered devastating burns. But despite suffering at the hands of the 5 kamikazes, the crew of the Newcomb kept their vessel afloat and earned the Navy Unit Commendation and 8 battle stars for World War II service. The Ki-48 transformation from laughingstock to terror weapon was complete. American pilots who had once mocked the Lily now scanned the skies anxiously for the distinctive twin-engine silhouette. The bomber they had dismissed as harmless had become, in its final incarnation, one of their most feared opponents. An official announcement by Combined Fleet Headquarters said that 2409 kamikaze pilots were killed in performance of their duty during World War II. How many flew Ki-48s to their deaths will never be known precisely. Records from those final chaotic months are incomplete, and many kamikaze units mixed different aircraft types depending on what was available. What we do know is that the Ki-48 served until the very end. The 90th Air Regiment of the 5th Air Army, based in Hopai, North China, equipped with Ki-48, was the only Japanese air unit in China proper to engage the Soviets, although others were advanced in preparation. It flew 20 sorties against the Soviets during 14 August 1945. Even as the Emperor prepared to announce Japan's surrender, Ki-48 were still flying combat missions. After the war, captured Ki-48s found new life in unexpected places. Indonesian Air Force, then Indonesian People's Security Force, operated one aircraft against Dutch colonial rule. This aircraft was put together from bits and pieces of a number of aircraft to become the first twin-engined bomber in the Indonesian People's Security Force. The Chinese communists also operated captured examples, using them in their civil war against the nationalists until they were finally retired in 1952. Today, only a handful of Ki-48 survive in museums around the world. There is a Ki-48 on display at the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, Moscow. The China Aviation Museum in Datingshan has a Kawasaki Ki-48 in Chinese Liberation Army Air Force colors. Some of the parts of the airplane are reproduced. The Indonesian Air Force Museum in Yogyakarta is also known to have a Ki-48 in its collection. These museum pieces, carefully preserved behind glass or roped off from visitors, seem almost peaceful now. It's hard to imagine them as instruments of war, harder still to picture young men climbing into their cockpits knowing they would never climb out again. The twin engines are silent, the bomb bays empty, the gun positions unmanned. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of the Ki-48 story. It began as a symbol of Japanese ambition and technological progress. When first introduced, it represented everything Japan hoped to achieve: modern, fast, superior to anything their enemies could field. The crews who flew those early missions over China must have felt invincible, masters of technology that would carry Japan to victory. Yet by war's end, that same aircraft had become a symbol of desperation and sacrifice. The Kai-48 that dove toward American ships off Okinawa were not triumphant expressions of Japanese air power, but admissions of defeat. When conventional warfare fails, when technology falls short, when hope begins to fade, even the most advanced machines become mere vessels for human desperation. John Chapman would earn a Bronze Star for his service. Years later, his view of his heroism is clear-eyed. People try to glorify wars and so forth. There's people that do outstanding things, but there's nothing really glorious about a war. You do wars to protect your country if you have to, and that's the only time you should ever do it. The American sailors who faced kamikaze attacks, including those Kai-48s in their final role, would carry those memories for the rest of their lives. The Japanese pilots who flew those missions are remembered now not as heroes or villains, but as young men caught in the machinery of war, transformed from bomber pilots to human weapons by circumstances beyond their control. The last Kai-48 kamikaze missions flew in the spring of 1945. By summer, the atomic bombs had fallen, Japan had surrendered, and the war was over. The surviving Kai-48, those few that hadn't been destroyed in combat or converted for suicide attacks, were quickly scrapped or abandoned. An aircraft that had once represented Japanese hopes for victory became just another relic of a war everyone wanted to forget. But we shouldn't forget. The story of the Kai-48, from its proud debut over China to its desperate final missions over Okinawa, reminds us how war transforms everything it touches. Advanced technology becomes obsolete. Confident pilots become desperate men. Bombers designed to strike and return become one-way weapons. And young men who should have been planning their futures instead plan only for their deaths. When American pilots first encountered the Kai-48 in 1942, they laughed at its weakness, mocked its inadequate armament, dismissed it as barely worth their ammunition. By 1945, no one was laughing. The Lily had shown them something they hadn't expected, that in war, even weakness can become a weapon, and desperation can transform the laughable into the terrifying. That transformation, from pride to desperation, from bomber to guided missile, from pilots who wanted to live to pilots willing to die, that's the real story of the Kawasaki Kai-48. It's not just the story of an aircraft. It's the story of how war changes everything and everyone it touches. And it's a story we must never forget, no matter how much we might want to. In those final months of the war, as Kai-48s dove toward American ships, two very different groups of young men faced each other across the Pacific. The Americans, fighting to end a war and go home. The Japanese, believing that their deaths might somehow save their homeland. Both groups were brave. Both were afraid. Both were trapped in a situation neither had created, but both had to endure. The Kai-48, Lily, flew for just 5 years, from 1940 to 1945. In that time, it went from being a symbol of Japanese technological advancement to a desperate last resort. It began as an aircraft its pilots were proud to fly and ended as one they flew to their deaths. That journey from hope to desperation, from conventional warfare to kamikaze attacks, mirrors Japan's own journey through World War II. Today, when we look at those surviving Kai-48s in museums, we should remember not just the aircraft, but the men who flew them. The confident pilots of 1940 who felt invincible over Chinese skies. The desperate young men of 1945 who knew they would never see home again. They were all human beings, caught in the terrible machinery of war, doing what they believed their duty demanded. At the time, Lieutenant Araki's wife Shaijk, who was carrying their child, was proud of her husband's sacrifice. "I thought it was natural that Hayuo would die," she wrote later. "It was for Japan," she explained later. "It was to preserve and protect the country. We were sending our loved ones off to die. It was the least we could do on the home front." Her chief concern was that his sacrifice had not been in vain and that he had managed to sink a ship. "Otherwise," she wrote, "he still lies at the bottom of the cold Okinawan Sea for nothing." The tragedy of the Kai-48 is not just that it failed as a bomber or that it was used for kamikaze attacks. The real tragedy is what it represents, the transformation of hope into desperation, of technology into sacrifice, of life into willing death. When we remember the Kai-48, we remember not just an aircraft, but the human cost of war, measured not just in lives lost, but in dreams destroyed, futures erased, and young men turned into weapons. The American pilots who once laughed at the Lily learned a bitter lesson. In war, nothing stays the same. The weak can become dangerous, the obsolete can become deadly, and the enemy you dismiss today might be the one that terrifies you tomorrow. The Kai-48 taught them that lesson in the skies over Okinawa, written in explosives and blood. A lesson that echoes still in the quiet museum halls where the last survivors of Japan's Lily bomber rest in silence. That silence speaks louder than any engine ever could. It speaks of wars ended, of lives lost, of lessons learned too late. And it reminds us that every aircraft, no matter how obsolete or weak or laughable it might seem, carries within it the capacity for both glory and tragedy, hope and desperation, life and death. The Kawasaki Kai-48 Lily, born in ambition, died in desperation, remembered now as a reminder of war's power to transform everything it touches. From the skies over China to the waters of Okinawa, from conventional bomber to kamikaze weapon, from laughter to terror, that was the journey of Japan's Lily. A journey that ended only when the war itself finally, mercifully, came to its close.